Thank you, Mark. I'd like to pick up from where Todd left off and the system that he alluded to very briefly, the system for processing aliens who have crossed the border illegally, and identify some vulnerabilities in that system. The Border Patrol interviews all aliens who are caught entering the United States illegally. If an alien asserts a fear of persecution, the arresting officer, as Todd noted, will refer the alien to an asylum officer for what's called a credible fear interview. The term credible fear means the significant possibility, taking into account the credibility of the statements made by the alien and other facts known to the officer, that the alien could establish eligibility for asylum. Where an asylum officer finds that an alien has a credible fear, as Todd noted, the alien is placed in removal proceedings before an immigration judge and can file an application for asylum. As a judge, I heard hundreds of these claims. Most credible fear claims are made by aliens from Central America, but, as noted, claims have been made from aliens, by aliens from such special interest countries or countries of concern as Syria, Pakistan, and a large number of Somalis. There are no hard numbers on the extent of fraud in the credible fear process. However, anecdotally, fraud is a significant issue in this process, as Todd alluded to, as aliens either exaggerate their claims or simply fabricate brand new asylum claims. As Todd alluded to, there have been identified instances in the past where smugglers themselves have either supplied the aliens that they were moving with fraudulent claims or explained to the aliens how to bolster their claims to make it more likely that they will be found to have a credible fear and to have the opportunity to be released and apply for asylum. In other instances, aliens abroad have found out that friends or family members have successfully applied for asylum in the United States and copy those successful claims. Finally, there are situations where aliens simply tell asylum officers or immigration judges what those aliens think the judges and officers want to hear in order to get released from custody. The credible fear process is vulnerable to such fraud for a number of reasons, and the biggest one is resources. There are only about 360 asylum officers who are stationed at 8 asylum offices in the United States, and none of those asylum offices is at a land border. This relatively small number of asylum officers limits the time that any given asylum officer can spend on any given credible fear claim, a problem that has been exacerbated by a massive increase in the number of those claims. In FY 2009, USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, completed 5,233 credible fear cases. 7 years later, USCIS received 94,048 credible fear cases and issued 92,990 credible fear decisions. Todd had mentioned before, there's a lot of focus on the refugee program, which brings in about 70,000 people. In 1 year alone, in 2016, 94,048 people claimed credible fear at the border, most of whom we didn't know and had no idea where they had come from. This is just too many cases for the asylum office to handle effectively. As a judge, I would often receive credible fear referrals from the asylum office, and some of those referrals were completed so cursorily that I really didn't have any idea what the claim was. Aliens would come to my court and ask to be released. I'd say, I need you to file an asylum application because, quite frankly, based on what the asylum office has given me, I don't really know why you're here. That speaks more not to the quality of the asylum officers because they're all diligent people, but rather to the massive numbers of cases that any given asylum officer has to handle. The burden on the asylum officers in the credible fear process is even more daunting when you consider the fact that those officers must also hear, there's 360, must also hear affirmative asylum claims, and those are claims that are filed by aliens already in the United States who claim a fear of persecution. In the fourth quarter of 2016, there were 194,986 asylum applications pending at USCIS, and that's in addition to the almost 93,000 credible fear applications the asylum officers considered that year. Again, 360 people, 280-some thousand applications. The asylum officers do have some help in identifying fraud in the credible fear process, however. USCIS's Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate, also known as FDNS, was created in 2004 to help ensure immigration benefits are not granted to individuals who pose a threat to national security or public safety or who seek to defraud the immigration system. It's a great idea. When it comes to asylum and credible fear claims, however, FDNS is even more shorthanded than the asylum officers are. According to GAO, as of FY 2015, USCIS had deployed only 35 FDNS immigration officers and 4 supervisory immigration officers to work across all 8 asylum offices. Again, 190,000 asylum applications, 93,000 credible fear claims, 35 people who are looking for fraud. Another factor that renders the asylum and credible fear processes vulnerable to fraud is the capability of USCIS and immigration courts to identify fraud. In a December 2015 report, GAO found that 3 factors inhibit USCIS and the courts in identifying fraud. The first is fairly basic. Neither agency has ever assessed fraud risks across the asylum process. Because of that, they don't really know what to do in order to respond to the fraud because they haven't identified the scope of the fraud that they have. And consequently, they don't have the controls in place to mitigate the fraud. Second, and this is incredible in the 21st century, USCIS's capability to identify patterns of fraud across asylum applications is hindered because USCIS relies on a paper-based system for asylum applications, and many of those are written out by hand by individuals for whom English is not a first or even a second language. For this reason, USCIS lacks the ability to compare any given asylum application with another. For example, or by contrast, you can type a phrase into Google, and within less than a second, you will find every document that is online that contains that phrase. USCIS doesn't have the ability to do this with just one form of application. And many of these claims are repeated again and again. That capability would put them in a stronger position to identify fraud and to question further cases that include such repetition. The third issue identified by GAO is that USCIS has given FDNS only limited guidance with respect to fraud and actually applies the same fraud detection procedures to all of the applications that the agency handles. Marriage fraud and asylum fraud are 2 very different things. Anybody who's ever been involved in immigration for a long period of time is familiar with the idea of the bed check. Basically, at 5 o'clock in the morning, if you've applied for a marital visa for your wife or your husband, officers will show up at your house and just make sure that everybody's there. You can't really do that with asylum, unfortunately, but it is a one-size-fits-all process with USCIS. Because of this, FDNS officers have to work in an ad hoc manner when they are assessing asylum fraud. I read an application. Oh, I remembered that I saw the same claim in the application. I should compare those 2 applications. Not a very efficient way for 35 people to work. In addition to agency constraints and limited fraud detection capabilities, there are other factors that render the credible fear process uniquely susceptible to fraud. A big one is evidentiary limitations. There's a saying in immigration law that persecutors don't give affidavits. For that reason, the evidentiary standard for asylum is necessarily lower than for other immigration applications. I have a marriage license. I can prove that I was married. This is the title to our car. Both of our names are on it. That doesn't exist in the world of immigration. By law, an asylum applicant's testimony may be sufficient to prove his or her asylum claim, even without corroboration. As Todd mentioned, sometimes you just have to go on the word of the individual. While this is important to protect legitimate asylum seekers, asylum officers and judges are often left with nothing but the alien's own testimony in making a credible fear or asylum decision. Many aliens admit, however, that they have spent months or even years making their way to the United States, including spending weeks at a time in safe houses abroad. This is time that an individual could putatively spend memorizing an asylum claim such that when arrested by immigration, they can regurgitate the claim that they have been given. Similarly, Fraud in a simple claim that depends on facts, some of which are true and some of which are fabricated, can be difficult to detect and even harder to prove. On May the 29th, there was a riot in my hometown. There are newspaper articles that talk about that. It's easy to say, I was involved in a political protest and the police caused the riot by coming in and beating people. We know that the event happened. We don't know that the person was there. Finally, a regulation that bars U.S. government disclosure of information provided in credible fear in asylum proceedings can make it impossible to verify or contradict an asylum applicant's claims. An effort to fix this vulnerability in the USA Patriot Act failed in committee, and that regulation has existed ever since. Fraud in the credible fear and asylum process is not a victimless crime. As GAO has found, quote, granting asylum to an individual with a fraudulent claim jeopardizes the integrity of the asylum system, close quote. In addition, as Todd has mentioned, aliens who posed a national security risk have abused the asylum system. The most famous one is Ramsay Yusuf. He showed up at JFK. He had an Iraqi passport. He said that he'd been abused, and he was released that evening. Ramsay Yusuf and his traveling companion, Ahmed Ajad, were the masterminds of the first World Trade Center bombing. Ajad actually carried with him certain documents that explained how to make a bomb, and so Ajad got detained. Yusuf got released, and Yusuf had to go to prison and visit Ajad so that he could figure out how to make the bomb that they put in the van that they blew up. More recently, as Todd Bensman has detailed in his writing and quite eloquently described, aliens with ties to terrorist organizations have been prosecuted for fraud when applying for credible fear. The most heinous of these cases is an individual who repeatedly raped and eventually impregnated a traveling companion prior to coming to the United States because he believed that it was more likely that he would receive asylum and get released if he had a pregnant wife. Fortunately, the authorities found this out. The Trump administration has taken some steps to address these issues. About a month and a half ago, it made changes, actually a little bit longer than that, it made changes to the training materials for asylum officers to tighten the evidentiary standards for finding credible fear. Under the Obama administration, there was a tendency to want to trust individuals who made claims hoping that they would get sorted out later in the system. That's been reversed by the Trump administration. The implication is, or the implementation of that is really the issue. By executive order, the president has directed the detention of aliens pending the completion of the removal proceedings. This is critical because the fact is a lot of people were hoping that they could get just past that first step, get in front of an immigration judge, and then be released. Happens in a couple ways. One, you can apply with the judge for a bond to be released. You have to show you're not a flight risk or a threat to national security. But as I mentioned, you don't really have a lot of information to go on when dealing with those people. The second is resource constraints. People in my court, in my experience, generally appeared before me, and 6 weeks later they were gone because ICE ran out of detention space and they prioritized the people that they released. So the Trump administration has taken the steps in order to mitigate that. Also importantly, because of the statements that the administration has made and is detailed on the front pages of most newspapers today, the number of individuals who have attempted to enter the United States and go through the credible fear process has dropped precipitously in the 70%. Because of this, there is now more detention space. More detention space means the longer that you can detain somebody, means the less likely it is that somebody's going to fraudulently obtain asylum, means the less likely that it is that somebody's going to attempt, that somebody else is going to attempt to enter the United States. It becomes a virtuous circle of enforcement that has shown itself based strictly, more or less, on the president's own statements. These are important first steps, but there's a lot more that has to be done, and I could go on all day, but Mark won't let me. So right now I'd like to hand it over to Mark Metcalf, who will address issues with non-detained aliens in court proceedings.